Good to be back with you all. This morning I want to look at probably one of my favorite stories in the Bible. It might be one of your favorite stories in the Bible as well. It's a story of resolve. It's a story, powerful story of people who, when the world is saying bow, they actually have the strength, they have the faith, they have the grit to remain standing. So I think it's incredibly inspiring, and I want us to dive into it together this morning. It's a long story in Daniel chapter 3, and so I have edited it down a little bit just for the purposes of kind of reading it this morning. So you can follow along, just kind of listen as I read a selection of the verses from the story just to kind of set the stage for us. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." At this time, some astrologers came forward. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "There are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar said to the Jews, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? If you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" And we'll pick up some more of the story kind of as we go this morning. But stories of resolve are inspiring, aren't they? Stories where people, it almost looks like what they're doing is so countercultural. It's so, it is inspiring, but it's also like convicting at times because you're seeing these people going, just where does the strength come from? The civil rights era, in our country is an era filled with stories like this, stories of grit and resolve that are incredibly inspiring, even convicting. Of course, maybe the most notable figure, most famous figure in that day is Martin Luther King Jr., and he was a man who stood when the culture of his day said bow down, before the status quo of segregation. He stood. I love this quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He said, "Every man from a treble white to a bass black is significant on God's keyboard, precisely because every man is made in the image of God. And one day we will learn that." He was a man who stood when the world said bow. And his namesake, of course, Martin Luther, was also a man who stood up, commanded to bow before the most powerful institution in the world. The Catholic Church stood. He said, "Here I stand. I can do no other." Martin Luther was a man who stood. Shortly after I became a Christian at age 16, I was in high school. Some of you are in high school. Became a Christian at 16 in my first Bible study that I was a part of with some other guys and our youth pastor who was leading it. And we came one week to this story in Daniel chapter 3. And I remember thinking to myself, I hope that one day if I'm put in a position where I am expected to bow down between something, before something other than Jesus, I hope that I will have the resolve. I hope that I'll have the faith. I hope that I'll be able to stand. If that day comes, I hope that I will remain standing for Christ. I remember thinking that very thought. You know what I've learned throughout the years in life? Maybe you've learned this as well. You don't have to wait. You don't have to wait for that kind of special day to show up where you're going to be tested. Every day that you wake up in the morning and your feet hit the ground and you head out into your day, there's a statue every day. There's a statue built by, maybe it's a statue built by kind of the culture at large of our day. Maybe it's a statue built by your employer. Maybe it's a statue built, maybe you built it. Maybe it's a statue built by a family member. And every day, there's a statue. And every day, the music is cued. And the question over your life is, will you bow your life down to something that is not worthy of it? And here's the thing. For you and for me, it's just as much a matter of life and death as it was for Martin Luther King Jr., Martin Luther, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because to bow your heart to anything that cannot hold the weight of your worship, the weight of you as an image bearer of God and your devotion, to bow your heart before anything that cannot bear that weight, it is toxic to your very soul. So, how do we become people who remain standing even when the pressures around us say bow? How do we become people who have this kind of resolve that we see in this story? Well, let's look through this story. I'm going to give you a couple of things that this story suggests that I think could help us become those kind of people. Here's the first one, and maybe this is going to throw you off the scent a little bit, okay, but go with me. I think it'll make sense in a minute. But the first thing that we need to do if we want to become people of this kind of resolve in our world and in our day is we got to own something about ourselves. We got to own our Nebuchadnezzar hearts. We got to start there. We got to own our Nebuchadnezzar hearts. Every great story has a villain, and we know who the villain is in this story. It's this fiercely insecure king of Babylon. He's the most powerful man in the world around 600 BC, but he is terribly afraid of losing that power. And in just one chapter earlier, in Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and in the dream there's this massive statue, and it's got gold at the top, gold all the way down to clay at the bottom, and kind of descending, quality of materials. And this statue is obliterated in the dream, and this rock that smashes the statue. And Daniel comes and interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And God gives Daniel the interpretation. He's like, hey, all these different materials in the statue, essentially they represent various kingdoms of the world. And this rock that is smashing it, well, represents God's kingdom. And kind of the point being, the moral of the story, is that all of the kingdoms of the world will inevitably falter. God's kingdom will remain forever. And Nebuchadnezzar is quite impressed by Daniel being able to interpret his dream. And so he begins to worship Yahweh. He begins to praise Yahweh. And so we're thinking when we get to the end of Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's become a Christian. He's been converted. I mean, a little bit of an anachronism there, but you understand. Nebuchadnezzar's been converted by the end of chapter 2, right? And then we turn the page and we get to Daniel chapter 3. And here he is building his own statue, the whole thing made of gold. I mean, what is he saying, right? He's shaking his fist at Yahweh going, my kingdom, my kingdom, my kingdom. So we go, what happened? Nebuchadnezzar get converted, and then he kind of, turned his back. Is he backslidden? No. Nebuchadnezzar didn't get converted. This was a polytheistic world. In Nebuchadnezzar's mind, he had a list of gods that he worshipped and paid homage to because these gods would do different things for him. And he just discovered in Daniel chapter 2, there's another one. I forgot about that. I didn't know about this one. It wasn't on my list. Yahweh, add him to the list. And so he adds him to the list. And it's like, whatever Yahweh needs, we'll do his little thing so that then Yahweh can also be a part of the gods who take care of who? Me. Right? At the end of the day, in his view, the gods existed to serve him. And so we see this character in Daniel chapter 3, and here he is. Now he's going to throw people in a fire. We go, man, what a creep. What is wrong with this guy? But we need to first look in the mirror when we see this guy. Are we too different? I mean, hopefully none of you have thrown anybody in a furnace anytime recently. If you have, just go to the police, confess. In the end, it's going to be better if you do that. But don't we have hearts that are not too different? I mean, like Nebuchadnezzar, when my comfort gets threatened, some anger can kind of flare up in me, right? Like Nebuchadnezzar, I've seen God do amazing things. I mean, he saw this incredible miracle, and here he is. And just like, same in my life. Seeing God do amazing things, you'll think, oh, I'll never turn my back on God again after seeing this, experiencing this, and then turn the page. And here I am back to living kind of for my own kingdom. And just like Nebuchadnezzar, I've got a whole list of gods in my life. And their temples aren't just open on Sundays. Every day they're calling to me to give my life over to whether it is the pursuit of security and comfort or pleasure, power, whatever it is, approval of others. They are beckoning every day that music is cued. So we're not too different from Nebuchadnezzar. And we're not going to be the type of people who stand resolved until at least first we look in the mirror and see that this is true of us. That we're actually, of all the characters in the story, there's one that we are most like most days, and it's the king, King Nebuchadnezzar. All right, that point was fun. Let's go number 2. Okay, how do we become people who have this kind of resolve and stand? Number 2, we got to embrace the Shadrach faith. So first, we got to own our Nebuchadnezzar hearts. Number 2, we got to embrace a Shadrach faith. So King Nebuchadnezzar's advisors, they bring word to him, hey, these 3 guys, they're not bowing down before your statue. So Nebuchadnezzar calls them forward, and he says, look, here's the deal. I'm feeling generous today, so we're going to strike up the band again. And now you're going to bow, or feel that heat? It's coming off of that furnace over there. That's where you're going to go if you do not bow. And then we don't know if it was Shadrach, Meshach, or Abednego, but they appoint a spokesperson, and one of them responds to Nebuchadnezzar after Nebuchadnezzar's little speech. But before he does, Nebuchadnezzar asks this amazing question. I want you to think about this question for a second. He says, what God will be able to rescue you? What God will be able to rescue you? That, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, that is the question of faith. See, this is a story of faith. That's the question of faith. What God will be able to rescue you? Everybody has faith. Even somebody who would claim, no, I'm against organized religion, or I don't believe in any God. There is some way in which they answer this question. Who will rescue you from the fire? However you answer that question, that's what your faith is in. Even people who claim to have no faith, there is something they are believing in to make the fiery trials of life worth it, bearable, survivable. What will rescue you from the fire? Who will rescue you from the fire? However you answer that question, that is what your faith functionally is in. And I say functionally because you could be in a church and say, well, it's Jesus, but when you lay your head on your pillow at night, you think about the number in the account that makes you feel cozy inside and secure. God forbid something were to happen in the economy or in your work, and you think about that, and that's what's getting you through the potential fire. It's your functional God, right? So how do you answer that question? Well, let's look at how Shadrach answers that question. Verse 16, Shadrach says this, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. I love that. He just starts with saying, first and foremost, we don't even need to answer your questions. Okay, then verse 17. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. And He will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But if He does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Now, This, if all it was just gall and swagger, this statement, it would be cool enough. It'd be great enough, right? It's an amazing statement to a king here, okay? But there's actually a lot that we can unpack in this statement. It's actually one of the first statements of faith. You know, sometimes in the church you probably, will state the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. This is one of the first creeds, statements of faith. It's a three-parter. Let me walk us through it because it's amazing. Part 1. First thing Shadrach says, our God is able to deliver us. Okay? So their faith is in a God who is able. That's the first part of their statement of faith. Our God is able. Now don't miss this. The strength of their faith and the strength of your faith, it has nothing to do with how much of it that you can muster inside of yourself. It has everything to do with the object of your faith. Okay? You can believe with every ounce in your body that the creator of the universe is a walking, talking banana. Doesn't make it so, right? The power of your faith is the object of your faith. So if you believe with just a tiny, tiny amount, like let's say a mustard seed. Sound familiar? But that tiny amount is in the true God who loved you, created you, saves you. Then that's a powerful faith. So they say our God is able. Even if they're saying that with their knees shaking, it's a powerful faith. Our God is able. Second thing that they say, and He will deliver us. So He's able to deliver us, and He will deliver us. Their faith is not only in a God who is able, but their faith is in a God who is good. That's the second part. He's good. Basically what they're saying is, look, we know the stories. We're Israelites. We're Jews. We know what our God has done in the past. This is the sort of thing that He does, okay? Because He's good, and He loves His people. All right? Our God's able. He's good. Third thing they say, but if not. Even if He doesn't deliver us from your furnace, guess what? We're never going to bow down to your gods. What are they saying here? He's not only able, He's not only good, most importantly, He's worthy. He's worthy. See what they're saying here? They're saying even if He doesn't miraculously intervene, He's still God, and your statue is not. They're saying there's only one who at the end of this story, however it ends, is worthy of all that I have. So whether He delivers us or not doesn't change His worthiness. He's able, He's good, and He's worthy. Have you embraced a Shadrach faith? He's able, He's good, and He's worthy. Have you embraced the Shadrach faith? Because it's not a matter of if the furnaces of life are going to come your way. It's a matter of when and how many and how long. And we'll buckle every time without a Shadrach faith. A faith that says, despite what I can see in front of me, He's able, He's good, and He's worthy. And so, He threw them into the furnace. Right? King did not like their answer. No surprise there. Verse 23 sounds like the end of a story. And these three men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. The end, the resolve of three faithful martyrs. But that's not where the story ends, is it? Verse 24. Then the king, he leaped to his feet in amazement, and he asked his advisors, weren't there three men that we tied up and threw into the fire? Because I see four. And one of them looks like a son of the gods. We got to look in the mirror. We got to own our Nebuchadnezzar hearts. We got to embrace a Shadrach faith. And here's a third, final point from this story for us. We got to encounter the furnace God. We got to encounter the furnace God. I see four, Nebuchadnezzar said. He says, come out. Come out. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they climb out of the fiery furnace unharmed. And the question that this text, of course, leaves us wondering is, who was that fourth man? And we can't help but guess, can we? the king even said he looks like a son of the gods. And scholars, they talk about how this is likely what we would call a pre-incarnate second person of the Trinity. In other words, a pre-incarnate Jesus. Okay? This is long before Jesus was born by Mary into this world, but a pre-incarnate a God and a man walking around in this fire with them. Of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they had never heard of such a thing. They had never heard of Jesus, but this is what they knew for certain. Here's the main point. What they knew for certain, God met them in the fire. God met them in the fire and delivered them. And this is so important for us to see. This story shows us God delivering them not from the fire, but within it to bring them out of it. He doesn't deliver them by sparing them the fire. He delivers them by joining them in it and taking them out of it. It's one of the hardest philosophical questions. Maybe you've wondered it. If not, at some point in your life you will. How could a good and loving God who's powerful, how could a God who's able, good, and worthy allow so much suffering in this world? Incredibly challenging philosophical question. It's been asked for ages. It'll continue to be asked until we see Him face to face, and maybe some of it will make more sense. We don't know exactly. We don't have a airtight argument or answer to that question. But you know what we have? We have a foolproof person. We have an airtight person. We have Jesus. And in Jesus we have this picture, this story told even more illustratively than the one that we're reading this morning of God coming into the furnace. What we do know, when we ask that incredibly challenging philosophical question, what we do know for sure is that He joins us. He's with us in the suffering of this world. He's with us in what we have to go through. He's the furnace God. Some of you know this personally. You know this personally. You were in a fire and He showed up. He was in there with you. And yeah, maybe there's more that we wish we knew in terms of explanation, understanding of the things we go through in life. But I'll tell you this. If I could only choose one and not the other, it would be His presence with me through what I'm having to go through. And only Christianity tells the story that we have a God in Jesus who nobody can look at Jesus and go, "You don't get it." And Jesus, He gets it. He understands it. He's been through it. See, that's the thing. He not only goes into the furnaces with us. In Jesus, God has gone into the furnace of furnaces for us. He's gone there for us to turn our hearts back to Him. Like Nebuchadnezzar, there are things that are like calling for our attention all the time. These gods, functional gods in our hearts and in the world, and saying, "Bow down to me." What's going to pull our hearts off of these small, petty things that we are prone to worship and put it on to the one true, able, good, and worthy God? It's going to be seeing that He's the God who meets us in the fires. And it's going to be remembering that He's the God who in Christ went to the fire of fires, the cross, for us. He's the only one worthy. Remember the old movie, hopefully some of you have seen it, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. It's the third one. It's the one where it's the last good one, frankly. It's the one where they're all trying to find the Holy Grail because they all believe it's going to lead to happiness and security and pleasure and power and all these things. So all these entities are chasing the Holy Grail, and they get to the end and they finally find it, but it's moved outside of the boundaries of where it can be, and so it triggers a whole earthquake. okay? And the earth begins to separate, and the Grail falls down into this little crevice. And one of the characters, Elsa, she falls down, but as she's hanging there, she's got one hand in Indiana Jones's hand, and the other, she thinks she can reach the Grail. She sees the Grail, it's right there. And he says, you can't reach it, you're going to fall, you're going to die if you keep trying to reach that Grail. And she won't give up, and she ends up slipping through his hand, and she falls to her death. And then soon after that, Indiana stumbles, and he falls into the same crevice, and he's caught by the hand of his father, okay? Played by Sean Connery, remember? Right? And he's holding Indiana's hand. And again, our hearts, they are pulled towards these things that we think will be enough for us. And he sees the Grail. And Indiana's thinking that he can reach it. Dad, I can reach it. And he's like, son, Indiana, give me your hand. And that's the thing that turns Indiana's gaze back to his father. It's the first time in the story that his father calls him by the name that he wants to be called, his true heart name, Indiana. It's the first time he calls him that. And his gaze turns towards his father, and he gives him his hand. I identify with that story in my life. I feel like oftentimes I got one hand in the hands of my father, and the other is reaching out for whatever it is I think will be enough and complete me. And you know what? When you hear your father say your name because he knows you and he loves you and he went there for you, you can turn your gaze back to him and give him your hand. And that's how we can stand strong, like these guys did, knowing he is able, he is good, and he is worthy. Do you hear him calling your name today, inviting you too to trust him with everything, so that you can stand in the fiery trials of life? Let me pray for us. Holy Spirit, would you encourage our hearts this morning? None of us stand like Jesus stood for us. Whatever standing we do is a very imperfect standing. And so we need your forgiveness, we need your grace, and we need your comfort, and we need your empowering, especially in our day, to continue to stand for Christ. Like Martin Luther said, here I stand. I pray that every day we would be able to say in our hearts, here we stand because Jesus stood and died and rose again for us. Pray in his name. Amen.